Hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'll get going here. I'm really thrilled to be presenting for you all today. I'm going to be covering basically what's my favorite place on Earth. And as Colin mentioned, I have been fortunate to travel to quite a few places, but all the places I've been to, there's no place I love more than our home province here of British Columbia, and in particular, Northern British Columbia is just absolutely spectacular and a place that I love very, very much. So this picture here is the Salmon Glacier. This is one of the largest glaciers in the world. It's about the fourth largest glacier in all of North America. And I like to start with this image when talking about Northern British Columbia, because this glacier here in far northwestern BC, kind of right on this border of Southeast Alaska, is a remnant from the last ice age. So there was a time not too long ago when pretty much all of British Columbia, with the exception of just a few small coastal areas, was under a massive sheet of ice. Of course, all those ice sheets have since receded, and we're now left today with just a few glaciers, which unfortunately are receding quite rapidly right now due to the effects of climate change, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But this here, the Salmon Glacier in northwestern British Columbia, is one of the most breathtaking places I've been to in the entire world. And gives you that feeling that reminds you that it wasn't too long ago, you know, just a few thousand years ago, a little longer than that, but not too long ago when our entire province was covered in ice. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself here. This is a picture of me in Kluane National Park in the Yukon, which is right on the border of northern British Columbia, just like 100 kilometers away. This picture was taken by my friend Ian Harland. As Colin said in his introduction, I love photography. I've been doing photography for a long time, but I also study biology at the University of British Columbia. So what I really, really love to do is combine my passions for photography and storytelling with my love of science to kind of tell these stories with my photos of nature, about nature, that share important conservation messages and important things in scientific research. And that's what I'm hopefully going to be doing for you today. So here's the province of British Columbia, and when we talk about what makes northern British Columbia so special, it's important to think about the biogeographic history of this area and the kind of the current geography of this part of the world. And I think a really defining feature of this part of the world is the Rocky Mountains. So if you look kind of on the east side of British Columbia, you can see the Rocky Mountain range running through that entire part of the province. And the amazing thing about northern British Columbia is that we have both the western and the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in our province. Even though we're a western province in the country, it is really northern British Columbia where east meets west from an ecological perspective, because those Rocky Mountains are a big barrier for birds and wildlife in western and eastern North America. But if you look to the north of British Columbia, you'll also see that there's some really impressive mountain ranges that kind of are extending down from more polar regions into northern British Columbia, particularly in the northwest there. So not only is northern British Columbia where east meets west, it's also kind of the southern extreme for a lot of northern and Arctic-like species, kind of reaching their southern extremes in northern British Columbia. So we're going to be going in here and looking at all these different northern and eastern and western birds and how they all kind of interact and meet in the northern part of our province. But I wanted to start out with just some birds that are kind of characteristic of northern boreal forest habitat. And one of the most beautiful and special of all those birds is, of course, the great gray owl. A very sought after species by lots of people, but really, although they occasionally kind of make it down into southern British Columbia, and there are birds throughout southern BC and in the lower 48 states, there are a lot more great gray owls up in northern BC. They are a really, really spectacular bird. You can see why they're so popular. So here's just a photo of a great gray owl perched on a fence post by a road. And this is how you often see them. You often see them hunting in kind of grassy margins near the edges of roads, kind of hunting for rodents. And they, of course, have phenomenal hearing, which they're using to kind of hear rodents potentially underground and under the snow and catch them. And for this photo here, the great gray owl was sitting on that fence post, and I had been, you know, crouched away in the grass some distance away with my telephoto lens for a while. and you know, anticipating the moment when this great growl would hunt, because, you know, presumably it's sitting on this fence post at dusk to hunt, and it took off and flew and dove into the grass there in front of that post. And I was fortunate that I was ready to capture this moment as that great growl flew towards me, silhouetted against the sunset skies. But it's not just owls that are characteristic of the northern forest. There's also a lot of little songbirds and stuff that are very unique to the boreal forest. And one of them, one of my favorites, is this bird here, which is the Boreal Chickadee. We've got 4 chickadee species in BC, the black-capped and the chestnut-backed, which are common in coastal areas and also go into the interior a little bit. We've got the mountain chickadees, which are more of an interior species. And we've also got the Boreal Chickadee, which is, when you get way up into the far north of British Columbia, it's the most common chickadee species, kind of up near the Yukon border. And it's one of my favorite birds up there. Here is another really special bird. This is a Bohemian Wax Wing. In the Vancouver area where I live, you know, we mostly see cedar waxwing. It's you know, it's pretty rare to see a Bohemian waxwing. It of course does happen, but they're not very common. But up in northern BC, that's actually kind of getting into the southern breeding range of this species. So when they show up here, it tends to be in the winter time, whereas they're nesting up in northern BC and even further north during the summer. Very beautiful bird. Here's another one that's found kind of in mountainous areas all throughout the province, but you can see them quite a bit up in northern BC. This is a gray-crowned Rosy finch, another really neat bird adapted to that high elevation environments, which we get a lot of up there. And one of my favorites, especially because of its song, is the white-throated sparrow, pictured here and kind of camping up in northern British Columbia, as I've done so many times. I just love waking up to the sound of singing white-throated sparrows. It's such a beautiful thing to start your morning with. So a few more little birds. We got olive-sided flycatchers nesting up there. And this one was perched on this top of this tree, flycatching on just an absolutely bucketing rainy day. The weather up there is often very unpredictable. So there's times when it's totally dry and there's times when it's bucketing rain. And one bird that I'm always surprised by how common it is this one here. This is the Wilson snipe, which is found pretty much throughout the entire province. But I'm always shocked, you know, up in northern BC, you'll be down in a lowland, in a valley, in the woods, and you'll see a northern snipe, or you'll hear them doing their winnowing display at dusk and dawn. And then you'll be up in the mountains, above the tree line in the alpine, in the middle of nowhere, and you'll still have Wilson snipes around. So clearly a bird that is very versatile with its habitat choices. Now, these birds here are Pacific loons, and Pacific loons are a very, very rare breeding bird in British Columbia. And we're going to be looking today at quite a few birds that I've been fortunate to encounter up in northern BC that you might be familiar with from seeing kind of in their non-breeding ranges where they're more common in southern BC. But as a breeding species, they're very rare in the province. And I think, I can't remember the exact number, but the BC Breeding Bird Atlas, I think, estimated there's something like 5 to 10 pairs of these birds in the entire province. So that's not a lot at all. And I was so excited to find this pair of Pacific loons nesting on a lake where we had read, like, there was a record like 10 years ago or something like that of Pacific loons nesting on this lake, but I don't know if anyone had even looked for them since then. And we were so thrilled to find a pair, and they indeed had a nest on this lake, which was super, super exciting. And as you can see, it was a really, really rainy day. So we have a few different strategies of birds that live in northern BC. It's a very harsh place to be in the winter. So the vast majority of birds up there are migrants. So they're birds that are up there for the breeding season, and then they're migrating down sometimes as far as South America to spend the non-breeding season. Then we have birds that are year-round residents, things like ravens and maybe some woodpeckers and chickadees. There's not nearly as many year-round residents as there are migrants up there. And then there's another group of birds which are nomadic. And I think the birds that best kind of represent this nomadic lifestyle are the finches, and especially birds like crossbills. So this here is a white-winged crossbill, a male with that beautiful reddish-pink plumage, and you can see how his bill crosses, and he's got those characteristic white patches on his wing. And these are nomadic birds basically following around wherever there's food availability. So they don't really have set migrations necessarily. They're kind of just more following where they find food sources. There's not just white-winged crossbills up there, although there are a lot, and they can be the most common birds in some years when there's a lot of food. But there's also red crossbills, which is one of my favorite birds as well. Now, this particular red crossbill here is a very, very special red crossbill. And if you attended a presentation, I think it was a couple months ago, maybe the September one, or October, maybe it was last month. I can't remember which one it was, but we had Matt Young present from the Finch Research Network. And Matt was presenting to us about all these different types of red crossbills, because we consider them one species. But here in North America, there's around 11 different distinct ecotypes or call types of crossbills that are a little bit genetically distinct from each other and often have kind of slightly different beak sizes. Now, this picture here seems to be the first photograph ever taken of the type 7 red crossbill, also sometimes known as the enigmatic red crossbill, which is arguably the rarest type of red crossbill in the world and the one that we know the least about. And I was hiking up in Stone Mountain Provincial Park with my friend Josh Brown, who you can see here, and we heard these crossbills calling, and the only way you can really reliably tell apart different crossbill types is by their sound. And we heard this call, and we knew it wasn't one of the types we were familiar with. The one we get down here in the Vancouver area is usually type 3s, which is a bird that likes hemlock trees quite a bit, but not exclusively, but they do like hemlocks. But we heard these calls, we didn't recognize them, so we recorded them and we got some photos. It was just up, if you look in the top of this picture, up in that valley with all the trees, that's where we had them. And upon analysis of the crossbill calls and confirmation with Matt Young from the Finch Research Network, we identified these as type 7 red crossbills. And these are the first known photographs of type 7 red crossbills. But it was even more exciting than that, because this adult male here had a couple juveniles in tow, a couple young that were very recently fledged, and the male was actively collecting seeds from these pine cones and feeding them to his young. So this was not only the first photos, but the first confirmed breeding record of type 7 red crossbills in the province of British Columbia, which was very, very exciting. And it was exciting enough that it warranted my first co-authored research publication on the confirmed breeding and a very range limit sighting, very far north sighting of the enigmatic or type 7 red crossbill, which is published in the BCFO's journal. But moving on, red crossbills are phenomenal, but it's, there's such an incredible diversity of birds up there. And another group of birds that I really love that you encounter quite a bit up in northern British Columbia are the chickens, or specifically things like grouse. So here we've got a mother ruffed grouse, and it's always neat to watch how they carefully make sure all of their chicks have crossed the road before they themselves get off the road and move themselves out of harm's way. But more than grouse, I love ptarmigans. And northern BC is one of the best places in the world, specifically a spot called Pink Mountain, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. Pink Mountain in northeastern BC is one of the best places to try to track down the rock ptarmigan, which is pictured here. Now, of course, ptarmigans are famous because they change their colors to match with their surroundings at different times of year. So in the wintertime, they're completely white to blend in with the snow. And then later in the summer, they often become very brown to kind of blend in with the rocks and the dirt and the soil in the alpine conditions. So you'd think a ptarmigan would be the most visible in the in-between season in this plumage pictured here, because this ptarmigan has a mix of white and brown. It's molting its feathers. But that's kind of what I expected. I thought, maybe this kind of early summer time would be the best time to try to see one because they won't be in either of their plumages. I was wrong. So here's a picture here, and this very rock ptarmigan is in this picture. You can try to spot it, and you might be able to spot it kind of in the, just kind of down and left from center, tucked into the rocks here, and I'll enlarge it here for you to see. But isn't it incredible, the level of camouflage going on here? Because this ptarmigan seems to know that it doesn't just blend in, but if it sits by these rocks covered in lichen, it really makes them blend in really well. So these are very difficult birds that you only really see up in the alpine. They're tough to track down. So we've kind of taken a look here at some of the northern species that kind of come into northern British Columbia. Now let's take a look at some of those eastern species that are more characteristic of eastern North America, Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, places like that, but their range extends into northeastern BC. So let's take a look at some of those birds. An absolutely beautiful species is this one here. This is the rose-breasted grosbeak, a close relative of our black-headed grosbeak down here, and a reasonably common bird in northeastern British Columbia. This here is a very common bird in northeastern BC. This is the yellow-bellied sapsucker, a very close relative of our red-breasted sapsucker and the red-naped sapsuckers that we get in in southern BC. And this is one of the easiest birds to find in the breeding season because their nests are everywhere and their young make a lot of noise. So it's very easy to find their nests. Here's a more uncommon bird in this region of the province, the Peace River region of the province, kind of around Fort St. John, is the Baltimore Oriole. We have Bullock's Orioles down here in northeastern BC. There's Baltimore Orioles, but they're very uncommon, and it can be one of the harder species to track down on a birding trip to the area. And all sorts of cool birds. Here's a LeConte sparrow, another bird that gets into northeastern BC. And this here is a Magnolia Warbler, which is kind of actually found all kind of throughout central and northern BC. And it's got to be one of the most beautiful warblers in the world. But I think one of the biggest draws for birders going to northeastern BC are those warblers, because the diversity of warblers up there is incredible. We've got the Magnolia Warblers. We've got these guys here. This is a male Black-Poll Warbler, which has an extremely high-pitched song. And a favorite of many, including one of my favorites, is this bird here. This is the Canada Warbler. And the thing that most of these warblers have in common is that they are doing long distance neotropical migrants. So they're breeding up in northern BC, and then they're flying all the way down to South America to spend the non-breeding season. So thanks to data submitted on citizen science platforms like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, they've been able to produce animations like this. So hopefully this works well over the Zoom screen share. I know sharing anything moving is difficult, but as you can see here, if you look on the right, you can see kind of what month it is. So this is where they are in December, January, right around New Year's. They seem to me to be kind of on the slopes of the Andes in like Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, that sort of area. And here we go, February, March, April, and then May. They're starting to move north, June, and by June, they're all the way through Canada. And you may have noticed the very extreme of where they go is northeastern BC. So the birds that are nesting around Fort St. John and the Peace region are the longest distance travelers. They're the birds traveling the furthest. So yeah, it's really cool. All these warblers do very similar migrations to this. And let's take a look at some more of these species. So probably the most common warbler up there is this one here. This is a Tennessee warbler, a very common bird in a whole big mix of habitats. Another one that is fairly easy to find is this bird here. This is the black and white warbler. Another bird with a very, very high-pitched song, but not quite as high-pitched as this bird here. This is a Cape May warbler. And the Cape May warbler is a very rare bird in northern BC. It's a bird that is somewhat eruptive in the area. They're very much attracted to spruce budworms. In years when there's a lot of spruce budworms in the area, there'll be a lot more Cape May warblers in the area, but it remains one of the rarest breeding birds in the province. Not an easy bird to track down, but it's not quite as rare as this bird here. This is the Bay-Breasted Warbler. And the Bay-Breasted Warbler is another one of these birds that is one of the rarest breeding birds in all of British Columbia. In some years, they're not seen at all. In other years, there's quite a few of them when they have a lot of food in the area. But a very exciting bird that I've been fortunate to see now. I think about, on four separate trips, I've managed to track down Bay-Breasted Warblers in northern BC. So I've been really lucky with these guys because they can be a very rare and difficult bird to find in the northern part of the province. But I was talking about, this isn't just, northern BC isn't just an eastern area from an ecological perspective. It's also an area where east meets west. So what we see are a lot of very, very closely related species meeting. And it's the only place in the world on their breeding grounds where these two species might meet. So on the left here, we have a Townsend's warbler, which is a western species. And on the eastern side of the Rockies, we have the black-throated green warbler, which is an eastern North American species. But up in northern British Columbia, where they kind of spill over either side of the Rockies, these two birds will meet, and they're very closely related. So they actually occasionally hybridize with each other and form offspring that are of mixed heritage. Now, one of my professors at UBC, Darren Irwin, has studied this and has had students study this interaction, this hybridization between the two. And it seems that while hybridization does occur, it's happening in a very, very narrow area. It's not a very big hybrid zone, and that the hybrids themselves don't have a lot of reproductive success. The hybrids are kind of selected against. So So in a sense, like no one really wants to mate with the hybrids as much as they want to mate with the pure birds. So for that reason, even though they hybridize a little bit, it's not sufficient to kind of cause a merging of these two species, kind of like we see with northern flickers, with the red-shafted and yellow-shafted birds. There's a lot of like orange ones that are intermediate. Hybridization is kind of limited enough and is not increasing. So these are still good separate species, even though they hybridize quite a bit. Here's three very closely related birds. In the top right is a Mcgillivray's warbler, a western bird. In the top left is a mourning warbler, an eastern bird. And these two birds are also ones that will hybridize up in northern BC, the mourning and the Mcgillivray's warbler. And in the bottom middle there is a Connecticut warbler, which is another one of these birds that can be quite difficult to find in the northern part of the province because it's just the very, very extreme of their range. And the best way to find them is by listening for, they have a very loud, explosive song, which is very distinct that you can listen for. Usually in very thick aspen stands is what they like. And sometimes you have birds that look almost identical, but are actually not that closely related. These birds are in different families. On the left is a hermit thrush, which is in the thrush-robin family, Turdidae. And on the right is an ovenbird, which is in the warbler family. I believe it's in Parulidae, which is the warbler family. And these two birds, despite looking almost identical, are not in the same family. And when this happens, this is what we call convergent evolution. These two birds have very likely arrived at this set of traits, this plumage, without kind of having inherited it from a common ancestor. Because this is not something we see in a lot of warblers. So I would personally guess that the ovenbird evolved these patterns for the same reason the thrush did. It's a pattern that probably works very well for camouflage in the forest. I see in the chat that there's a gray square. Let me see if I can do something about that. I have the chat open on the side. So if I close the chat, maybe that will get rid of it. But also if I close the chat, I won't be able to see your messages telling me that there's no longer a gray square. So hopefully that got rid of it. I suppose you can also use your mic and stuff to tell me if it's still there. But yeah, hopefully that got rid of it. So we have the hermit thrush on the left and the ovenbird on the right. And sometimes two birds look quite different, but are the same species. So this here is the yellow rumped warbler, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. We see a lot of them here. And there's the eastern form of the yellow rumped warbler on the left, the myrtle warbler, and the western form of the yellow rumped warbler on the right, the Audubon's warbler. And the western form is that yellow throat, the eastern form is that white throat. And these are, again, two birds which we actually see cross over the Rockies a little bit, but they hybridize quite extensively, and they are considered one species, even though they can look quite different. And moving beyond just like warblers, we have blue jays in northeastern British Columbia, whereas in the rest of the province, we have our provincial bird, the Steller's jay, which you can see here on the left. And one of my favorite examples is the wrens, the winter wren and the Pacific wren. So if you've been birding for a while, you'll know that we used to call all of these wrens just winter wrens. And then I think around, I want to say maybe like 2010 or 2013, somewhere around the early 2010s, these species were split from the winter wren into the winter wren and the Pacific wren, with the winter wren being found on the eastern side of the Rockies and the Pacific wren being found on the western side of the Rockies. And this research was done under my professor of ornithology at UBC, Darren Irwin. And they have looked at a lot of these birds and they found that hybridization crosses between them is extremely rare. I think they've only ever found like 2 birds that have genetics indicating mixed parentage. So it's very rare to find hybrids. But because these 2 birds look identical, more or less, one of the best ways and pretty much the only reliable way to tell them apart is often by listening for their song. So I'm going to play the song here and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Okay. I'm just checking the chat. Okay, so I'm going to play the songs here, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Here, let's start with the winter wren. Have a listen to this song. So a very beautiful song, very beautiful, carries far in the forest. And let's listen to the Pacific wren. Yeah, so the Pacific wren and the winter wren. Now, kind of at a first listen, those two birds might sound quite similar. They might sound quite similar, but when you get to hear them quite a bit and several times, those can sound very different. And in northeastern BC, we have winter wrens and Pacific wrens meeting. The only place in the world where they tend to do this on the breeding grounds. And specifically, there's a town called Tumbler Ridge, which is where the study was done that split the winter wren into two different species. Now, northern British Columbia is a very fascinating area from a biogeographical perspective, east meeting west, and kind of from an evolutionary perspective with these eastern and western birds. But it's also a very popular area for people, and specifically, not just any people, but specifically for industry and development and projects. So one project you've likely heard about is the Site C Dam. It's a project proposed to, kind of increase energy production coming out of northern BC, mostly produce energy for export out of the province. And it's also been assessed to have potentially the largest environmental toll, among the largest environmental tolls of any project in Canadian history. And this here is a picture of the valley that will be completely flooded. It's a huge area. This is just one small area of it, but this is the valley that's going to be completely flooded upon the completion of Site C. This tree that you see here, I believe it's an aspen, will be almost completely underwater. And this beautiful sedge marsh, which you see in the valley, is home to the endangered yellow rail, one of the rarest birds in all of the province. And this is one of the only spots to see them. And all of this habitat will be completely gone. And it's not just the yellow rails, it's also critical habitat for a lot of other threatened birds and mammals in this area. So it's going to be a very devastating project from an ecological perspective. Now, yellow rails might become a whole lot harder to find very soon once this project is completed. It's already one of the hardest birds in British Columbia to find, but yeah, they're going to become much more difficult once this marsh is gone. But if that wasn't enough, the yellow rails also are facing other issues because this valley will get flooded. But this past summer, I couldn't find a yellow rail up there, and nor could anyone. From what I've heard, no one was able to find a yellow rail in northern British Columbia this summer. And that was almost certainly due to drought. It was a very, very dry summer up there. Now, this is a photo I took up in northeastern British Columbia this past summer of a wildfire. I was driving with my friend Josh from Fort St. John to Fort Nelson, and there had been a lot of lightning, but it was mostly dry lightning. So there was not a lot of rain, and it hadn't rained much at all for quite a while. And this was right during that huge heat wave that we had last summer, where we were hitting up there. It was like 36 degrees, but it was even hotter down in Vancouver. But it was very hot, very dry, and there was lightning, and it started quite a few big forest fires. This one here, we were just driving and we spotted the flames on a hill, maybe 20, 30 kilometers away from the highway. There wasn't any real cell reception there. We tried to call it in, but by the time we kind of reached the spot where we could call it in, it had already been called in, this fire. And this was the very start of it, but this turned into a massive wildfire that burned a huge area of forest. It came right down from this ridge, like 30 kilometers away, all the way across the highway and continued on for quite a while, burning a huge, huge area. And, these wildfires, we'll talk about a little bit more about them here because wildfires do play an important ecological role. There's a lot of birds and animals and trees that need fire. But unfortunately, with climate change and increasingly dry and hot conditions in the summer, we've seen the frequency of wildfires increase quite a bit in recent years, and it's been burning huge areas of land. So while fire is important, too much fire is not a good thing. And these woods in the aftermath of forest fires are often eerily quiet. Often birds are very upsettingly absent from these ecosystems for a little bit. But also, just weeks after the fire starts, you already start to see succession beginning with these green grasses growing in the woods. Now, there's places up in northern BC, and now, honestly, throughout most of the province, where as far as you can see, there's burnt trees. But I was interested, if I were higher up, just how extensive are these burns? How big are these fires? So this is an image I took with a drone that I sent up. to kind of document the extent of this fire. And pretty much all the way to the horizon in every single direction, the trees were burnt, which is not a good news for a lot of animals, but there is one bird that relies heavily on burnt forest, and that is the black-backed woodpecker, this bird here. This is very much a burnt forest specialist species. Black-backed woodpeckers follow around burns, and they'll often kind of live in burns that are like 3 to 10 years old. That's often where you see them most often, and that's because those dead trees are very soft, so a lot of bugs kind of bore into the bark, and that attracts a lot of woodpeckers, and the wood itself is very soft, so it's great for making holes in the trees to get those bugs and to make nests. So, you know, there are birds like the black-backed woodpecker that need forest fires quite a bit. And I don't know if this has been studied or not, but when I look at a black-backed woodpecker and I see that completely solid black back, I got to think that that's an evolutionary adaptation to blend in with a burnt tree. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that was the case, because it makes sense that they would blend in very nicely with a dark charcoaly tree. But it's not just climate change and dams that are threatening northern British Columbia. Of course, there's a whole lot of forestry going on. Of course, forestry is a very important thing. You know, we have needs for wood, but unfortunately, it's been conducted quite unsustainably in many places for quite a long time. And this is my friend Ian here checking out a big pile of logs that was along a logging road. And I wish I had a drone at this time, because pretty much multiply this by hundreds. Because these log piles went on they just went on and on and on and on. But the animal that's probably being impacted the most, or at least is receiving the most attention as a result of logging, is the caribou. And caribou spend part of the summer up in northern BC, up in these subalpine areas. And they will do well in these subalpine areas, but there are large parts of the year that they're spending down in the forest. And caribou don't do well in forest that's been logged. They really need to have mature forest. That's where they do well. And as a result of a lack of mature forest, we've seen the caribou decline. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of blame being placed on wolves, because wolves are a predator of caribou. It's one of the things that they eat. And the government of British Columbia is spending a lot of money to kill a lot of wolves in a desperate attempt to save the caribou. Now, most scientists' opinion on this is that it's killing wolves. Sure, you're alleviating a predation threat off the caribou, but without intact habitats, we're probably not going to see a big caribou recovery, because it's the lack of habitat that's kind of caused their decline in the first place. But it gets even more complicated than that, because there's some animals that sometimes benefit from logging a little bit. And an example of that is there's evidence that animals like moose do somewhat well in logged areas. There's a lot of growth in these clear cuts. And when moose populations increase, that can increase the population of their predators, the wolves, which then can bring a newly increased predation stress onto the caribou, which are declining because of a lack of good habitat due to unsustainable logging practices. So this is a very, very complex ecosystem that is being altered due to human causes. But I definitely don't want to see these caribou disappear anytime soon. Now, I know this is a bird-focused presentation, but I did want to show you some of the other wildlife that we sometimes encounter up in northern British Columbia, because there's some really special species up there. And one of them is this one here. This is the stone sheep, a close relative of the bighorn sheep. And British Columbia actually contains, I believe, the majority of the world's population of stone sheep, and most of them are up in northern BC. So this is an animal that you quite often see kind of in mountainous areas, sometimes below the tree line in the forest, like this one, which was resting at the top of a cliff on a rainy day, and sometimes up in the alpine. And this beautiful ram was at the top of this hill, and it was a very stormy day. This was actually the day with all that lightning that caused the wildfires. And he was just beautifully kind of silhouetted at the top of this hill. And I put the photo in black and white just to kind of emphasize those beautiful patterns in the clouds. Another animal that we see a lot of up in northeastern BC along the Alaska Highway quite a bit are wood bison. And wood bison were hunted to extinction in the province of BC. There were no more wood bison. Following the arrival of settlers to this area, they very quickly killed all of the bison for their fur and their bones and to make way for cattle. But we've seen in recent decades these bison reintroduced, and there are now once again herds of bison roaming in northeastern British Columbia. And they're always a real treat to see, because this is a very impressive Very, very impressive animal. And they're often kind of right along the edges of the highways because that's where they've got grass to feed on. So occasionally they'll cross the road. And this was taken with a telephoto lens because I was out of a car window, because you definitely don't want to be anywhere near these animals on foot. Not that they're out to get you or anything, but obviously they're a large and powerful animal. And as a large and powerful animal, they don't have many predators. And it was very interesting this one time seeing this beautiful black bear interact with a herd of bison. The black bear seemed very confident walking right up to the bison, which were all just kind of laying down in the grass. But as soon as the bison stood up and started walking towards this bear, that bear turned around and ran in the other direction, which was probably a very wise choice, because I don't think this little black bear would have stood any chance whatsoever against these bison. But yes, black bears are a very common sight in northern British Columbia. There's a lot of space for them to roam. They do quite well. There's been days up there where I've seen upwards of like 25 black bears in one single day. And as with any area where there are bears, it's important to be very respectful of them. We don't want to make them uncomfortable. We don't want to be approaching them. We want to monitor their behaviors and make sure they're not being affected by me if I'm stopping to watch a black bear. And over the years, I've seen now hundreds of black bears. I mean, it's got to be getting close to like 500 now. And I'm happy to say that I've yet to have any kind of negative encounter with a bear. The reality is that these animals often get a very negative reputation and are thought to be dangerous and predators. And it's not that they can't be dangerous, because they certainly can be. But I feel that, if you treat them with respect, you don't leave garbage out, you're aware of their behaviors, and when it's time to move on, there's no reason that we can't coexist with these beautiful animals. And it's not just black bears. There are of course, grizzly bears up in this area as well. And this is one of my favorite photos that I've taken of a grizzly bear up in northwestern British Columbia, crossing the highway with her 4 little cubs in tow. And, the science side of me tells me not to anthropomorphize this photo, but there's got to be some kind of curiosity or fear or some kind of emotion going on in these little cubs. Because, I mean, just look at their expressions. I think they kind of speak for themselves. So this was a very neat moment. But I wanted to move on now to take you to what is really my favorite place on Earth. I call northern British Columbia my favorite place on Earth, and it is. But specifically, my one favorite area up in northern BC is the Haynes Triangle. And I just have this little subsection of the presentation here dedicated to the Haynes Triangle. Because this area, which is the far, far northwestern corner of BC, is so incredibly unique. And I'll tell you why. So if you look at this map, the Haynes Triangle is up in the very, very top left, where the red pin is. It says Tatshenshini-Alsek Provincial Park. And it's called the Haynes Triangle, I think, because it's kind of the area of BC here. The political borders are like triangular shaped, and it's surrounded to the south by Alaska and to the north by the Yukon. So the only way to get to the Haynes Triangle, which is in British Columbia, is by driving in through Alaska or the Yukon. And if you want to go in through Alaska, you have to take a boat to get to Haynes, Alaska, and then drive in. Or you can drive a few hours away from Whitehorse up in the Yukon. But this area is so incredibly gorgeous. It is home to the St. Elias Mountains, which I believe is the tallest mountain range on the continent. It's the tallest mountain range in North America. And in this area, just up in the Yukon, is Mount Logan, which is the tallest mountain in Canada. But what really makes this area special is that it's a very Arctic-like ecosystem, despite the fact that it's located hundreds of kilometers south of the Arctic. And the birds and wildlife and the scenery here are very much Arctic-like, even though it's in the province of British Columbia. So let's take a look at some of those birds that are in the area. The predominant habitat in this area is tundra. In the valleys, you kind of get subalpine scrub, but up in the mountains, it's tundra. There's no trees. You've just got mosses and lichens growing on the rocks. And one bird that you often see running around in the tundra is the Semi-Palmated Plover, which you can probably see on the right side of the screen there. The Semi-Palmated Plover. And this is probably a bird that you're maybe familiar with seeing occasionally down here. We get a lot of them migrating through Boundary Bay during the spring and fall migrations and on the beaches all around coastal British Columbia. And the northwestern corner of British Columbia is where they nest. They also nest quite a bit further north, but there are a lot of them nesting in northwestern British Columbia. And this is one of the most common breeding birds in the area. And here's just a close-up look at these semi-palmated plovers. And when we see them migrating through the Vancouver area, they're not in their breeding colors. So it's really nice to see them in their beautiful breeding plumage when they're up there with that really nice contrasting dark necklace, which we sometimes see it here, especially in spring. But all of the birds look like this up in the Haynes Triangle. But there's other shorebirds as well. And one really special species is this one here, the wandering tattler. And the wandering tattler is not really a common bird anywhere in the province. And the Haynes Triangle in the northwestern corner is the southern extreme of their breeding range. So they do not breed anywhere further south than the Haynes Triangle. And even in the Haynes Triangle, they are quite rare. It takes a little bit of hiking up into the mountains, usually, in order to find them. I've been fortunate to see one next to a road once, but they usually are up in the mountains, up in like near riverbeds and little wetlands and lakes, high in these very high elevation areas. And this here, yeah, this is a classic example of their habitat. They're often on kind of like very bouldery riverbeds up in the mountains. And you see pairs of wandering tattlers, which is a crazy thing to see a shorebird in the mountains, and especially a bird like a wandering tattler. And here's another photo of one of these birds. Now, the wandering tattler, like most of these birds in northern BC, is a long-distance migrant. And here's a map of the world for reference. I don't know if you can see my mouth, but if you look at where British Columbia, Canada is, you can see the northwestern corner there. That's the Haynes Triangle. And these wandering tattlers are nesting all throughout kind of, this part of the world, up far north, Alaska, Yukon, Haynes Triangle. And wandering tattlers migrate down to Pacific Islands. So some of them will go to Hawaii. Some of them will go a lot further down into like French Polynesia. And I believe some of them go all the way down to like Australia and New Zealand. So these are really Pacific Island loving birds. So when they're not breeding in the most beautiful mountainous places near the Arctic, they are down in the Pacific Islands foraging on beautiful tropical beaches. And here's just one more photo of a wandering tattler at sunset. And this bird did a beautiful wing stretch for me. So I managed to get this picture here after it spent some time preening its feathers in this beautiful sunset light. This sunset light lasts a long time because this is far enough north that the sun sets around 11:30 p.m., 11:30 p.m., and then rises again just a few hours later, like 3:30 a.m. And it never really gets dark. You're kind of in twilight all through the night. You can easily go for a hike at any time. It doesn't get dark enough to make it challenging at all. So there's very beautiful long sunsets if you're so lucky to get some nice weather. But there's lots of other shorebirds nesting in this area too. We've got the lesser yellowlegs being another fairly common example, and also birds nesting in these wetlands that aren't shorebirds. And one of my favorites are the trumpeter swans. There's often a pair of trumpeter swans on pretty much every single nice lowland wetland in the Haynes Triangle. Any big pond that has like lots of grass and vegetation for them to hide in and build a nest, you'll usually find a pair of trumpeter swans. Another bird you sometimes find are short-eared owls. Short-eared owls nest up in the mountains here, especially around these wetlands where there's a little more shrubbery. And this one did a beautiful flight right over top of me. And I snapped this photo here. But there's one shorebird which, until a couple of years ago, was not known to be a bird that was breeding at all in the province of British Columbia. And that is the whimbrel. This here is a photo of a whimbrel on top of a tree. And if you're like me and you live in Vancouver and you're used to seeing shorebirds on the beach, it's probably very bizarre to see a whimbrel sitting in a tree. But this is a very, very special bird because the whimbrel was only discovered nesting in the province of British Columbia in 2019. Sid Cannings, who I'm sure some of you know, was out. He lives in Whitehorse, and he was out there with a couple other folks looking in some of the wetlands around here and located a couple pairs of whimbrel. And he found the nest with the egg. So this was the first ever breeding record in the province for this species. And I went there a couple weeks later and managed to track them down. But more precisely, they tracked me down. As you can see here, this photo, this whimbrel is flying in right towards me. And these whimbrels were very territorial. They did not like having me around. And I respected that, so I did not spend too long around them because, you know, there's only probably a few of these in the entire province that are nesting. So I don't want to disturb them from their activities. But they are sure really amazing birds to see kind of in the wetlands in the middle of the mountains, landing on the tops of trees. It was very, very spectacular. And I returned there again this past summer and returned to the same wetland and found the whimbrels in more or less the exact same spot. So it seems that they have taken up residence here, nesting, and have hopefully done very well, I hope, raising some young. And here's another look at one of these whimbrels on the ground, and one of them landing at the top of a tree, which again, as someone who's used to seeing shorebirds on the beach, is very unusual. But both times I went into the marsh to see these whimbrels, something interesting happened. And that was that both times the whimbrel's attention and my attention briefly went elsewhere. And the first time, the whimbrels flew in to investigate what we were doing in their area. And very quickly, they actually turned around and started flying the other way. And then I started hearing, me and my friend Ian, we started hearing this loud, like crashing sound through the shrubbery. And it's very dense shrubbery here. So there's a lot of things that could be hiding in there that you have to be aware of, like grizzly bears. But in this case, it was a big bull moose, probably the biggest moose I've ever seen by far, which you can see in this picture here. He was probably close to half a kilometer away here. He was very far, but he made a lot of noise, and the whimbrels went right over to that moose to give him a piece of their mind for coming near their territory. And then this past summer, when I was in there with my friend Josh, we were hiking in there, and I spotted some brown blobs, maybe like 50 to 100 meters out in front of us in the marsh, and the blob started moving, and we realized very quickly that we were looking at two grizzly bears out in this marsh. Now, for the first 30 seconds or so, they did not know we were there at all. Bears have very poor eyesight, so just because you can see them doesn't mean they can see you. But what they do have is an incredible sense of smell. And very quickly after we spotted them, the wind started blowing, and it was blowing from us right towards them. And they instantly did this. They stood up and looked right towards us, but it only lasted a few seconds. And immediately after, they turned around and ran off in the other direction. And that's pretty characteristic of how most bear encounters go in these places. They really don't want anything to do with people. And usually they either don't care or run in the opposite direction. But it's still very, very important to be bear aware, carry bear spray, not have any kind of attractants around you when you're out in these areas, because, you know, these are powerful animals. They're worthy of our respect. Now, I'm guessing these are probably two younger bears, maybe recently left mom, because it's pretty unusual to see two bears together like this. And they didn't seem kind of large enough to me to be like a pair that was like mating or anything like that. I'm guessing these were probably like cubs that were recently on their own after being left by mom. But just to show you another animal that we see in that area, there's foxes. And I'm blown away by these foxes because they're living in such a harsh environment. You know, it's reaching like -30, -40, potentially even colder in the winter time. And it can reach upwards of 20 degrees in the summer. So they're in a huge variety of temperatures. And this fox here, if you look in its mouth, it's got an entire bird's nest of baby birds in its mouth. So this fox caught a nest of baby birds. And I know this is a little bit gruesome, but if you're feeling bad for those birds, you can feel bad for this little guy if he doesn't get a dinner. These foxes are busy gathering food for their young, which they have in dens in the area. And the young are pretty cute. This is actually the only young fox that I've ever seen. Yeah. But another animal that I've seen a couple times up in northern BC is the lynx. And lynx are common in this area. You just don't see them that often because they're very, very elusive. And lynx, they're kind of the size of like a medium dog. They don't really pose any threat to humans. In fact, I'd say they probably, of any animal I've seen, like care the least about humans, and that like this glance that this lynx gave me lasted just a few seconds and was the only time it looked anywhere close to my direction when I spotted it. But the lynx in this area are very closely connected to snowshoe hares. And their populations fluctuate quite a bit around the populations of snowshoe hares and vice versa. So when there's a lot of hares, the lynx population is going to increase because they have a lot of food, they can produce a lot of young and provide for those offspring. But then as the lynx population increases, now there's a much larger predation pressure on these snowshoe hares. and that's going to cause a collapse in the hare population. So now we've got declining hares, we've still got a lot of lynx, but all of a sudden there's not enough food for all of these lynx. So what we'll see is a decline in the lynx population. And then once the lynx population has declined, the snowshoe hare population will once again increase, causing an increase again in the lynx population. So these are what we call population cycles. And I think it's around like maybe like an 8 to 10 year cycle around there that these populations kind of increase and decrease and increase and decrease. And these two species are very, very closely connected. And such a special animal. This particular encounter was just so incredible to see an animal out being itself, acting naturally in its natural habitat. And here's one more lynx photo, kind of in black and white here again to showcase how it was camouflaged in the woods, but also standing out with like a little bit of light shining onto the lynx there. But if we're going to talk about camouflage, we got to talk about the ptarmigans again. And the northwestern corner of BC is the best place in the province to try to find a willow ptarmigan. And they camouflage very well, so they're still very hard to find, especially the females, like this one pictured here, who for this photo was in some green grasses, so she actually stood out a bit. But the males are a little bit easier because they are very beautiful. Look at this male with this beautiful dark kind of brownish red feathering and white belly and beautiful red eye comb there. Such a spectacular bird and one of my favorite species in the Haynes Triangle. And this photo here in the snow is actually from northeastern BC, near Mackenzie, which is the only other place in the province I've seen a willow ptarmigan. But in the Haynes Triangle, they're quite a common bird around there. And I've also seen rock ptarmigan in the Haynes Triangle. Here's a photo of a male rock ptarmigan up there. But there's one more thing I want to talk about with the Haynes Triangle here. Actually, a couple more things. But the first is the story of, I've said I have a lot of favorite birds, but there is one bird that I love more than all the other ones. This habitat is absolutely spectacular. I mean, I couldn't think of a more beautiful place for beautiful and birds to be found. And somehow, when you're in a beautiful environment, all the birds find a way of being beautiful. And I find even seeing these birds in their breeding plumages makes it really special. Like take these mew gulls, for example. Look how, or I guess they're now called short-billed gulls. Look how spectacular these mew gulls look on their breeding grounds. But this isn't my favorite bird. They do share habitats with my favorite bird, but what my favorite bird is this one here. This is the Arctic tern. And the Arctic tern is the longest distance migrant of any animal on the planet. So there were trackers attached to birds, I believe in Europe, that were clocked in at about 90,000 kilometers in a single year. So that's like doing like more than 2 round trips, I believe, around like the circumference of the Earth every single year. And the reason why they're traveling so far is because these birds nest up in the Arctic and then down kind of into northern British Columbia, like into the Haynes Triangle. And then they go spend the non-breeding season in Antarctica. So they literally couldn't go any further. And if you think about it, when they're in these northern areas, they're in almost exclusive daylight. And when they're in southern areas in Antarctica, they're also in almost exclusive daylight because it's almost always summer wherever they are, because it's summer when they're in the northern hemisphere. And then when it's winter up here, it's summer in Antarctica. And that's where they are down there. But it goes beyond this because the Arctic tern doesn't just migrate like 90,000 kilometers in a year. They also live for 30 years and can be very, very precise migrants, returning to the same spot, the same nest year after year. And often they mate for life, they'll keep the same mates for a very long time. So they'll be not just flying across the globe, they'll be returning to the exact same pond that they were at every single year before and meeting up with the same mate that they bred with the previous year. So this is such a special bird. And when I first visited the Haynes Triangle in 2017, I did a hike up into the mountains. This was with my dad at the time in 2017. And my dad and I found a pair of Arctic terns nesting over a beautiful pond in the Alpine. And then when I returned again 2 years later in 2019, I did the same hike up to the same pond and the Arctic terns were still there. This was a beautiful stormy day and I captured this photo here. So this is a really, really spectacular migration that they were doing. And it's not guaranteed that this was the same pair of Arctic terns, but given how they often return to the same spots, there's definitely a chance. I was looking at the same birds 2 years later after they had made a trip, a couple of trips to Antarctica and back since then. So this is my favorite bird. And just for a fun fact here, I have it written on my other screen. So in their lifetime, an Arctic tern can migrate 2.4 million kilometers, which is equivalent to traveling the circumference of the Earth 60 times or traveling to the moon and back more than 3 times. So this is an amazing bird species, and it's my absolute favorite. But the very final story I wanted to tell about the Haynes Triangle actually connects more to the little birds. And in specific, one little bird. There's lots of little birds up there. We've got American pipits, we've got horned larks, this one here. We've got gray-cheeked thrushes, and it's definitely the best place in the province to try to see a gray-cheeked thrush. We've got lots of sparrows. We've got these American tree sparrows, and we have golden-crowned sparrows, among others. But there is one bird that I want to see more than any other bird in the Haynes Triangle, and I haven't yet seen it. And that bird is the Smith's longspur. And this is not my photo. It's the only photo here that's not mine because I haven't seen this bird yet. But the thing about the Smith's longspur is that Smith's longspur is like a very, very specific breeding habitat. They like willow shrubs, which is a very common subalpine plant that you see in high elevation areas, but they like these willows to be just like a foot or two tall. They like them very, very short. And in the, through the 1900s, these birds were seen quite regularly in the Haynes Triangle. I think they were discovered maybe first seen in like the 30s or 40s, but were confirmed breeding like in later decades, like in the 70s and 80s. And there was a lot of this habitat then, this willow shrubbery that was just like a foot or two tall. But the last time a Smith's longspur, to my knowledge, was seen in the Haynes Triangle was in the 90s, or at least breeding there. And the reason why they seem to have disappeared is because all of the areas where they were once found now look completely different. So with climate change, the amount of snow in the wintertime has been reduced. There's less snowpack, and the growing season has gotten longer. So there's a longer period of time when the vegetation is exposed to sunlight every single year because there's less snow and it melts quicker. And as a result, the willow shrubs that were once just a foot or two tall have now grown up in some cases to be much taller than I am. And that's no longer suitable habitat for the Smith's longspur. So this could potentially be the first case that I'm aware of a bird disappearing from British Columbia due to climate change. They haven't been seen, at least in the Haynes Triangle, for quite some time. There were some birds seen in another mountain in northern BC in the BC Breeding Bird Atlas period a bit over 10 years ago now. Not confirmed breeding, I don't believe, but good indications that they might be breeding there. But yeah, this is a bird I really want to see, but might not ever be able to see in BC because of climate change. Now, there's a chance that maybe some suitable habitat still remains somewhere higher elevation, so I'm certainly going to be returning back there and trying to search for them and see if I can, rediscover this bird in the Haynes Triangle. But yeah, this could potentially be a bird that's been lost from the region due to climate change. And climate change is with the growth of those willows, it's very, very evident in these areas, and hopefully not an omen of what's to come for the entire Arctic, because as a spot that's very Arctic-like, but existing quite a bit south of the Arctic, we could quite easily see climate change really rapidly change the Haynes Triangle even faster than maybe it changes the Arctic. But I hope this habitat will be intact for these birds and all these animals for a long time to come. But I do want to say that if you want to come on a trip to northern British Columbia, I briefly mentioned in a birding section committee meeting with Nature Vancouver, maybe we could do like a Nature Vancouver or some kind of trip to northern BC to look for birds and animals and all these sorts of things. So if you are interested in coming on a trip to northern British Columbia, shoot me an email so we can get a sense of some interest here. There's so many beautiful areas and not a lot of birders get up there. So there's a lot of birds that are uncommon, and it's the only place in BC to see them. And there's also a lot of birds that just not a lot of people have gotten a chance to see in this province. So if you're interested in coming to northern BC, send me an email, and my email's on this next slide as well. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for attending the presentation today. I'm so thrilled that with the turnout, I'm so glad everyone showed up to watch me present. So I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And I hope you can kind of agree with me here now that the northern part of the province of British Columbia has got to be one of the most incredible places on the planet. It's certainly my favorite place. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I'll stop sharing so we can go into gallery view. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask or put them in chat.
Wow. Oh, one thing I'd like to say, Liron, is thank you very much. Your enthusiasm and your knowledge of that area is just incredibly impressive and enjoyable. You're obviously extremely enthusiastic about what you saw and your desire to share with the rest of us. And I'm sure people will agree it was an amazing presentation. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
What time of year did you tend to go up there, Liron?
Great question. So I've been up to northern BC several times in kind of the June, July time of year. I would say the best time of year to be birding in northeastern British Columbia, like Fort St. John, the Peace River region, is like early and mid-June. The bird activity really starts to fall off in late June and early July, not because they're not there, just because they're a lot less active and they're not singing as much, so they're a lot harder to find. But in the northwestern part of British Columbia, like the Haynes Triangle, because it's high elevation and it's tundra, spring comes a bit later. So the best time to be in that area is kind of like July. Early July is a really good time to be there. But I want to go to these places outside of the summer. Because I'm in school, I'm at UBC for the non-summer season. I've never really had a chance to go up there outside of the summer, but I'm actually thinking of maybe going up there this winter and seeing what it's like in the snow. So we'll see. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I see a couple questions in the chat. Michael says, could you comment on the camera equipment you use to photograph the birds? Yeah, for sure. So these photos in this presentation have spanned several years. So there's several different cameras used. There would be some taken with a Canon 7D Mark II, some taken with a Canon 5D Mark IV, and some taken with the new Canon R5, as I've kind of upgraded my gear over the years. And the lens I use for most of these images would be my Canon 100 to 400 millimeter version 2 lens, which is a very lightweight, versatile telephoto lens, which I really love to use. And I'm mostly photographing handheld. Not that I don't like tripods. It's just like I'm doing, when I'm up there, I'm doing a lot of hiking. I'm needing to react really quickly a lot of times. So it's useful to just be holding your camera, not trying to put down the tripod and frame it up like that. Thanks so much for all the comments in the chat, everyone. How can we make this presentation available to all of BC Nature's member clubs? I think it's being recorded for the Nature Vancouver YouTube channel, but also if there's another organization that wants me to give this presentation to your group, feel free to shoot me an email about that as well, and I can just come and give it directly to you as well. So yeah, feel free to shoot me an email anytime. Any funny stories to share from all of my adventures? I mean, there's a lot of stories. There's so many stories. I'm camping a lot up there, like certainly with the Haynes Triangle in particular. There's no services, so there's no hotel, there's no restaurant, there's no nothing. You've got to be camping pretty much if you want to spend more than just like a day trip in that area. Northeastern BC is a lot more accessible. There's a lot more towns around there. So there's all sorts of funny stories with like tents being blown around in windstorms and like getting caught in torrential downpours and having to like try to dry out your tents and all sorts of stuff. There was one time a moose decided it would like sit down right next to my car, and I had to wait like 30-45 minutes to get back to my vehicle because the moose, I didn't want to like scare off the moose, so I was just like waiting for the moose to leave. And it just like I decided to sit down right next to the car. Yeah, so many funny stories. Lots of good adventures. Good question. Have you been to Lard Hot Springs? Can you speak about that ecosystem? Yeah, I've been to Lard Hot Springs like 3 times now. That's a really unique area. Some of the photos actually you saw today, like the Bohemian Wax Wing was from Lard Hot Springs. I think one of the moose photos was from there. The Lard Hot Springs is a really, really neat spot. It's located in the Northern Rockies, maybe like 3-ish hours east of Fort Nelson. And it is kind of one of these zones where east meets west. So it's one of these places where you see both western and eastern birds, like mourning and Mcgillivray's warblers in one spot. So it's a cool spot from that area, from that perspective. And then also because they're hot springs, it's a wetland that doesn't freeze in the wintertime. So I've never been there in the winter, but from my understanding, it's a very important spot for like animals like moose in the winter because it's a wetland that doesn't freeze. And it actually has an endemic snail. There's like a snail species that's only found in the Lard River Hot Springs. So yeah, it's a very, very unique place. Any bear attacks? No. Yeah, like I said, I've seen probably close to 500 black bears now, most of them being in northern BC, and probably getting close to like 100 grizzly bears now. And I've never even been close to an attack. I've like never even really had what I would consider a negative experience. And I think that just comes down to we're trying really hard to be respectful of them, giving them a lot of space, respecting their boundaries, and monitoring their behavior. Because I think it's very possible for people to coexist with bears if we're being bear smart. Like I don't want to be eating my dinner and leaving all the scraps around my tent. It's just not a smart thing to do. But yeah, thanks for the questions, everyone. And thanks for all the comments. I really appreciate it.
I don't know if can you hear this, Liron?
Yep.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. Could you talk a little bit about a couple of your photos that just were so powerful? The photo of the wolf or the lynx? Like what is involved in getting you, the photographer, into the position to get a shot like that?
Good question. So there's kind of two things that can happen. Sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes you spend a ton of time. And usually to get the best shots, it requires a little bit of both. You can just go for a drive and see a lynx. It's possible, but it's not likely. The best way to see something like a wolf or a lynx is simply to spend a lot of time out in the places where they are found. Now, I'd like to say like that you got to go hiking in the wilderness. I find the best strategy for finding wildlife is to simply cover as much ground as possible, which often just means going for drives down like old back roads or highways and stuff like that and looking out for wildlife that way. But you know, it's oftentimes I'm not necessarily searching for a specific animal, but you're just spending so much time in these areas where they're found that eventually you're going to have the encounter. Sometimes you are searching for them, but sometimes you just run into animals. It's the way it goes, especially up in northern BC. And sometimes it's brief and you don't get any photos. And sometimes the animal gifts you with a really special experience. And if you're ready with your camera and you've been, you know, and you're monitoring their behavior for, you know, those interesting and unique moments, you can get some pretty special photos. Because I agree, those are amazing animals. And I certainly don't take it for granted that I've been fortunate enough to see animals like that. And it's just a phenomenal part of the world. Like I feel so lucky to live here. Like I wouldn't want to live anywhere else outside of this province right now because it's just so spectacular.
Yeah, I guess it also wasn't just the animals, but it was the setting, like how you composed it, like the wolf, the color of the logging behind and the reflection.
Thank you.
Like,
yeah, I find something that's often overlooked and that by photographers and that I always recommend to photographers, like I love to teach photography, teach workshops, that sort of thing. One of the things I always say is like, the animal is only part of the photo. You know, there's a lot more going on in any given environment than just the animal. And the photos that tell the best stories are the photos that don't just capture the animal, but also capture aspects of the environment that go together with the animal because, you know, they're often very closely connected. And I think a mistake that a lot of photographers often make is just trying to get as close as possible. And close-ups can certainly make for really powerful and beautiful photos. But I think there's times when it makes sense to include the environment in the shot because often the environment is just as spectacular as the animal itself, and it really helps tell that story. Thanks for that question, Bev. Question in the chat from Linda. What raptors do you see in northern BC? Good question. I didn't include that many raptor shots, not because I haven't really seen a lot of raptors. It's just that they're very difficult to photograph. With the exception of like occasionally running into like a cooperative great gray owl or something. But I would say red-tailed hawks you see quite a bit. You have like the Harlan's hawks up there, which is kind of one of the more northern subspecies. In the Haynes Triangle, I would say the most common raptor might actually be the golden eagle. You very regularly see golden eagles soaring up there, and they probably nest on a lot of the cliffs in that area. There's hawk owls around, although I've yet to actually see one up there. There's goshawks around. So goshawks are another one. Two of my most wanted birds, which I've not yet seen up there, is the Boreal Owl, which would be a lifer for me. I've never seen one. And there's a lot of them up there. They're just really hard to find. And then another one is the gyrfalcon, which I've seen down here, but they actually nest in the Haynes Triangle, and that's like the furthest south that the gyrfalcon nests. And I really want to try to find a gyrfalcon in the Haynes Triangle, but they're pretty uncommon. There's not a lot of them. But thanks for the question.
Technical question, Liron. When you're off camping and way off in the wilderness and you're not near electricity, what do you do about camera batteries?
Good question. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two things. One, if I'm near a vehicle, I can plug my camera battery into a car vehicle, a car battery, like you can adapt it to like your regular plug in your car, like a USB or a cigarette lighter type plug. So I have ways to charge the batteries while driving. Yeah. So if I'm in these areas and I'm driving somewhere, I pretty much always will plug in a camera battery, because it's like you just got to take advantage of every chance you get. And the other way is just to bring a lot of batteries. You just got to bring a lot of batteries, because if you bring one battery, it's not going to last.
No. Thanks.
Yeah, and memory too. A lot of memory, like memory cards, hard drives, all that stuff. Yeah. Solar chargers. Yeah, I wanna look into that. And I think a solar charger would be a good investment. One of the problems with solar chargers, though, up there is that like the weather is so unpredictable. Like I've gotten sunshine on some trips, but on some trips I've just gotten days and days of bucketing rain. So, but I think that would be a good investment. I also bring like portable batteries, like power banks, which I can like charge. They often store enough power to like charge up a battery once or twice. So,
oh, good.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone so much for all the questions. And yeah, it's been lots of fun. One more I see. Have I ever seen a snowy owl up there? No, I haven't. I actually think there's probably not a ton of snowy owls up there. Certainly not in the summer. In the winter, there might be some, but still not a lot in the winter. But if I go up there this winter, I'll be looking out for them.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liron. It's been a great presentation. Quite a few comments in the chat about how your enthusiasm for the subject has been visible, and that's really great to see. Yeah. The quality of your photographs is also amazing, and all very impressed. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope one day to go on that trip to Northern BC. You know a lot of the special places, and so yeah, I look forward to that. So thank you very, very much, and thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Harvey, for hosting this, and
thank you so much.
And well, stay safe, everybody, and I hope you have a good evening and a good weekend. So yeah, thanks again, Liron. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Stay safe.